Heather Bollech-Fonseca. She will bring the theme of Spirit's prayer power and effect in the physical realm. Heather Bollech-Fonseca was born in upstate New York and currently lives in South Florida. She actively participates in the dissemination of Spiritism through writing, translating, and speaking. She's the co-founder of the Leon Denny Spiritist Group and co-developer of the website explorespiritism.com. She is also the author of the recently published book, Changing Lives with Spiritism, Fresh Perspectives for a New Humanity. Professionally, Heather works in the field of project management. Welcome, Heather.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Today we are talking about prayer. But we're going to talk now not about our own prayers, but the prayers of our discarnate brothers and sisters, those no longer living here on earth, and the effects of those prayers in the material world. One thing that we really get a chance to discover in Spiritism is the almost unbelievable amount of ongoing work that is done by devoted spirits in the spiritual realm who offer assistance, protection, rescue, and guidance in benefit of fellow beings in both the spiritual and the material worlds. We also realize that this is all part of divine order. In the hierarchy of spiritual life and evolution, God's children progress by answering the call to help others. As part of my presentation today, I'm going to include some examples from a few books written by the Spirit Andre Luis through the medium Chico Xavier. In these books, there's all kinds of illustrations of heavenly assistance, provided with narrative examples and powerful visuals that show us how all that looks in action. Given the ever-reliable outpour of love from the spiritual realm, when we think about the effects in the material world of the prayers of discarnate spirits, we're most likely going to think of good and loving spirits as the ones who the prayers are coming from, naturally. But before we get there, I would like to acknowledge that the spiritual influences we receive do come from spirits at all different degrees of progress and moral condition. And I'd like to make it clear that my discussion here today will focus strictly on the action, magnetic power, and subsequent influence of prayers coming from good and well-intentioned spirits. Why do I even mention that? Well, in the book The Messengers, the instructor Aniceto tells our friend Andre Luis that what he calls evil prayer has enormous potential, he says, as inferior spirits mentally intertwined respond to one another on the lower planes. Because even in such cases, every time a spirit assumes such an attitude, a communication link is established between it and the beyond. But he adds that it is the power of impersonal prayers addressed with goodwill in the name of God that receive a response from the higher spheres. Also in the book Between Heaven and Earth, when Andre's companion, Hilario, asks the mentor Clarencio if a person bent on committing a crime could be using a type of prayer, Clarencio tells him, let's refrain from using the word prayer when dealing with imbalance, and let's use invocation instead. Whenever, he says, anyone nourishes the desire to commit a wrong, he or she is invoking powers of a lower order. and is mobilizing resources for which he or she will be held accountable. And so I wanted to point out these examples to address that aspect or interpretation or possible usage of the word prayer when we're talking about an invocation. But today we're going to refer specifically to the prayers coming from spirits who work in God's name. In the way we normally think about prayer, it will typically come in the form of a direct expression of words or a direct elevation of thought, either in praise, gratitude, or request, as we heard earlier today. Now, we read a lot in Andre Luis's books about work done by good spirits in the spiritual realm, spirits who want to help others, and in this work, they do employ the resource of prayer before, during, and after their activities. Sometimes we have a chance to witness through Andre's observations their outward expression of those prayers. But it is important to be aware that to do the kind of work that they do, they really need to be in a sort of continuous state of prayer. Have you ever been in a situation or environment where you have found yourself surrounded, maybe even targeted by negative energies, and tried to keep your own thoughts balanced and loving? It's not easy, right? Well, these spirits travel through places, even here in the material world, that are very dense with the vibrations of spirits who emit unhappy, disturbed, sometimes even abhorrent thought forms. And they see things that, thank goodness, we do not. So to protect themselves and to maintain that state of mind that will allow them to be of help to those who suffer, they have to remain with their thoughts elevated while staying calm and focused. This is something they need to maintain. But as I mentioned, sometimes where we find where Andre Luis writes about them engaging in prayer when their actions can be witnessed by others. So in the book, Between Heaven and Earth, we find an unhappy spirit named Odila. And this is a case that was mentioned very briefly a little bit earlier, so we're going to learn a little more. Odila has been exerting a very detrimental influence over an incarnate spirit, a person here on earth named Zulmira. And Zulmira had become the wife of a man who'd formerly been Odila, the discarnate spirit's husband, before her disincarnation. Now, Odila is persecuting the incarnate Zulmira with accusations of stealing her husband and murdering her son following a tragic incident that is narrated in the novel. And this action is causing Zulmira a great deal of suffering, putting the spiritual progress of herself and her family at risk. And at one point in the story, we see a caring spirit named Clara, who comes to speak with Odila and interrupt her vengeful thought pattern. After lifting her thoughts in prayer, Clara finds an incredible, loving, and delicate way to appeal to the vulnerabilities of Odila's heart. She convinces her to leave behind her vengeful attacks on Zulmira and to instead accept help that is being offered to her, through which she'd eventually be able to see the son that she so loved and she so missed. Just moments before that intervention, the incarnate Zulmira had been found in bed, in a state in which she was apathetic and disconsolate, in a state of anguish and fear as Odila drew viciously on her energies. But now as Odila leaves and Zulmira is left to recover, we see how Clara's intervention saved Zulmira from a situation that could have turned for the worse. This is an example of a discarnate spirit's unseen action in the material world. Now, before Clara approached Odila, Andre describes how she first stretched out her arms in prayer and the beautiful scene that subsequently unfolded. And he writes, "The room gradually filled with a light that radiated outward from Clara. Our new friend was like a star that had suddenly descended to the earth, with two arms extended like wings ready to take sublime flight. A large aura of splendor like etherealized luminescent gold surrounded her light sublime form. Waves of varying tonalities radiated out from it, in circles that closed in on themselves, going from shades of gold and opal to light pink, bright pink to sky blue, then light green and soft violet, which then changed into other hues I could not discern. It seemed to me that Clara had become the center of an imaginable, miraculous rainbow. The whole house seemed too small for that blessed spring of soothing, indefinable rays. Even Odila quieted down as if under the control of that soft constraint. Andrea was so impressed by this visual manifestation of love emanating from Clara that he sought an explanation. And his instructor at that time explained to him. He said, "Clara has attained the complete equilibrium of her force centers, which send out luminous, distinct undulations. In prayer and at the inflow from her lofty mind, she emits vibrations from her purified sentiment, vibrations that constitute the projections of the beauty and harmony flowing from her being. If we were on her evolutionary level," he said, "we could have an immediate relationship right now with that higher plane of consciousness. We could perceive the glorious message that arises from her heart instead of these radiations which appear to us now as only a display of light and color. Instead of these radiations which to our ears are music and language, wisdom and love from a wonderful living thought." Here we see that the Spirit Clara did not come to chastise Odila for her actions in that moment. Instead, knowing of the underlying hurt that led Odila to such imbalance, and knowing too of Zulmira's weaknesses that allowed for such an influence, she acted only with compassion for the both of them. And through her connection with the higher realms, she was able to find the needed words to calm Odila's heart and take her focus in a different direction, likewise bringing through such action much needed relief to Zulmira. And you know what? Every day all over the world, individuals are receiving help like this. How often we are all assisted and we don't even realize it. And so it is so important for us to keep our thoughts elevated, for us to be vigilant of our thoughts so as to attract and merit this kind of action from our spiritual mentors and friends. I take you now to a different time and place in the book, In the Greater World, where we find another Spirit's prayer also effective in simultaneously helping individuals in both the spiritual and material worlds. This case took place in a mental hospital, where the thought patterns of an incarnate man and his discarnate obsessor, who's the spirit of a man that he had murdered 20 years prior, had their two minds intricately linked, causing great harm to the both of them. Andre's instructor then, Calderaro, explained this situation. And he said, here are two individuals whose minds are fixated in primary instincts. The incarnate one, after pounding his own thoughts with repeated vibrations, fleeing from his memories and remorse, has ruined his motor centers. He has disorganized his glandular system and disturbed his vital organs. Now the discarnate one has used all his energies to feed ideas of vengeance, where he remains isolated from reason and altruism. Their situation would be different, he said, if both had forgotten the offense and had picked themselves up through constructive labor and fraternal understanding in the sanctuary of true forgiveness. As Andre describes, Calderaro then applied magnetic passes. He applied some healing energies to the incarnate patient, which allowed the patient's spirit to be released from the body as the body was able to rest, and the spirit was released to the spiritual realm where he was able to see his own tormentor. Then the instructor told Andre that his own knowledge would not be sufficient to help these two spirits, and soon they'd be joined by another spirit whose more developed capacity to love would be needed in this case. That spirit was named Cipriana, and when she arrived, she was greeted by Calderaro's words of gratitude and reverence, but her reply to him is truly an example for us. She told him, "The divine Lord knows that I am still far from having accomplished all that you think I have. I'm still fragile and imperfect, and I must progress infinitely more to acquire the love that strengthens and perfects." And this kind of reply from this spirit, despite her degree of advancement, reflects the humility that characterizes the more advanced souls. In attending to what she called the simple duties of a maternal heart, Cipriana approached both of these unfortunate men and assumed a posture of prayer. So here again we have a discarnate spirit connecting with the higher realms, higher sources of light and love, to assist her with the help that she's about to give. And again, Andre describes a beautiful scene. He writes, "Her short prayer must have been saturated with sublime power, because a gentle light soon descended from on high onto her venerable brow. Cipriana gradually became more beautiful. Divine rays flowed down from invisible sources to envelop and transfigure her completely. I had the impression that her peri-spiritual body was absorbing that wonderful light, retaining it within her being. After a few moments, she was surrounded by a resplendent aura, the sanctity of which I felt I had to deeply respect. Startled but not concerned, I saw radiations of faint and gentle light flow from her eyes, her chest, and hands." Now, in terms of the impact of that prayer, Andre goes on shortly after to say, "She stretched out her hands toward those two unfortunate souls and touched them with her loving magnetism. I was amazed as I saw the power of that sublime woman changing their vibratory fields. They both felt weakened, overpowered by a force that compelled them to keep still. Experiencing both respect and fear, they looked at each other with unspeakable astonishment, overwhelmed by an irrepressible and unknown emotion." Now, in this book, you can read more about what happened after that and about the whole history between the two men that led up to this particular situation. But let me tell you that the conversation and the interaction that ensued following that humble and selfless prayer became the catalyst for a new beginning for both of those spirits, as they would now begin to take steps down the long but worthwhile path of spiritual renewal. One more example that I want to present to you is one in which we will actually expand on our conceptual definition of the material realm. Because this takes place in the spiritual dimension, but of a region very close to the earth's surface. And in Spiritism, we learn that the zones, so to speak, of the spiritual realm, within such close proximity to the earth, they are of a denser vibratory level. They are of denser energies, where discarnate spirits who do not have the mental and emotional state at that time to take them to higher realms are drawn. And so there we find dark, inferior, and unhappy environments. And in Andre Luis's books, we find several descriptions of such places. But as we learn in Spiritism, that no corner of God's creation goes without the presence of divine providence, we also find in those novels depictions of the work that goes on in benefit of the beings who dwell in such darkness. Work that is carried out by spirits who endure those conditions to bring their love in execution of God's will. And so in the book, The Messengers, we find a scene that takes place at a rescue outpost located in the lower zones. Now, these outposts are sort of like protected areas that serve as a kind of home base for spirits who travel there from spiritual colonies of relatively higher regions to give a treatment and to work in the rescue of spirits who are there, discarnate spirits, who are suffering, but are willing to open themselves to the help that they're there to give. And so sometimes these rescue outposts are kind of like hospitals for critical care in the lower regions of the spiritual world. The moment described in this scene is during an evening prayer time, when all the workers at that outpost are gathered to pray. They're praying for over 1,000 sleeping patients, all of whom are fortunate enough even to be inside the rescue outpost and are receiving daily nourishment and medication. Only a small portion of them showing enough signs of potential improvement to receive further treatment at that time. And I would like to share with you some excerpts from one of the prayers led by a worker named Ismaela for a few reasons. Number one, even though the prayers were being said directly for discarnate spirits, we know that any work being done in benefit of our discarnate brothers and sisters, especially so close to the earth, is going to have an indirect impact on those of us in the physical world, precisely because of the way that our two realms are in this constant state of mutual influence and interaction. Number two, Ismaela's prayer gives us a chance to observe the kinds of thoughts and sentiments that are expressed by our spiritual benefactors when they pray. And we can be sure that they pray in similar ways for those of us living here on earth. And third, Ismaela's heartfelt appeal exemplifies some of the very elements from the approach to prayer that we find encouraged by Spiritist teachings. And so she begins with this humble expression of reverence. Lord, she says, please deign to assist our humble wards by sending us the light of your sanctifying blessings. We are here, ready to do your will sincerely determined to serve your high intentions. With us, Father, are brothers and sisters still asleep, anesthetized by the spiritual denial to which they yielded while in the world. Awaken them, Lord, if it be your wise and merciful will. Awaken them from their sorrowful and unhappy sleep. Awaken them to the idea of responsibility, of righteous duty. Magnanimous King, have pity on your suffering subjects. Compassionate Creator, lift up your fallen creatures. Righteous Father, forgive your unfortunate children. Let the dew of your infinite love fall on our humble rescue outpost. May your will be done rather than ours, but if possible, Lord, may our patients receive a life-giving ray from the sun of your goodness. You see, she's praising God, and she's showing her respect for the superiority of divine will. Now, is that kind of thing important for God? Does God need for us to praise him before our answers can be heard? No. This is important for us because it helps us to properly focus our attention, to summon our own humility in recognition of God's greatness. And for those who were present in that prayer session with Ismaela, it helped to foster the unity and the synchronization of their thoughts. Still in her prayer, Ismaela goes on to describe some of the conditions represented by those sleeping patients. And we don't have time to go through the whole thing today. But all those patients were suffering the impact of having neglected their spiritual obligations while on earth. And she says, "Now they sleep, Father, waiting for your holy intentions. But we know, Lord, that this sleep does not bring rest to their thoughts. Nearly all our patients are victims of terrible nightmares for having forgotten your commandments of love and wisdom while in the material world. Although they appear to be immobile, their spirit moves amongst anguishing afflictions that we sometimes cannot even imagine. It is they, Father, your wandering children and our companions in struggle, who need your fatherly hand to guide their way. Almost all have strayed from the straight and narrow due to suggestions of ignorance, which like a giant spider weaves its web of misery, entangling destinies and hearts. Entreating your mercy for them, we also implore for ourselves this sense of true universal fraternity. Teach us to cross the barriers that separate us so that we may see in those unfortunate ones a brother or sister in need of understanding." You know, sometimes we feel such remorse for some of the unfortunate choices that we've made, and we can sometimes feel somehow reluctant or embarrassed to pray to our spiritual mentors. But they are not there to judge us. So just look at how with these words, Ismaela demonstrates a total refrain from any kind of judgment or criticism, and instead she shows a will to be understanding of her fellow beings' weaknesses and of the inner torments that each of them now suffers as a consequence. Recognizing that their failures represent only temporary setbacks, she simply makes a plea for God's loving hand to guide them to their awakening. And then, not only does she display such a compassionate understanding for those lying physically dormant before her, she goes beyond that to guide her fellow workers and prayer givers through a sincere proclamation of humility. Help us, she says, to understand so that we may finally lose every impulse to condemn others on the byways of life, Teach us to love them as Jesus loved us. Lord, we who beseech you here were also spiritual lepers, blind of understanding, paralyzed of will, prodigal children of your love. In times past, we also slept in the rescue outposts of your mercy. We are simple debtors, eager to pay off our immense debts. We know that your goodness never fails, and trustingly we await for your blessings of life and light. By the way, this scene is not without its own amazing description of visual wonder. And time will not allow me to share every detail. But for example, Andre describes a great quantity of these beautiful white flakes that he says seemed to spill from heaven and fall copiously on the heads of all who were in prayer. After which, luminous bubbles of different colors began to fall from their foreheads and chests and then rise and travel to reach the multitude of sleeping patients. According to Andre's instructor, the colors of the bubbles and the speed at which they traveled reflected the capacity of each individual who emitted them. And this is something that reflects what Spiritism teaches us about the power that moral character, intensity, and sincerity give to our prayers. These few examples that I've cited today are ones where we find the description of spirits engaging in the act of prayer. This is the way we normally think about prayer. But as has already been stated today, prayer in a broader definition really need not be so limited. Because in the book Spiritism in its Simplest Expression, Kardec reiterates the instruction from the Spirit's book that good deeds are the greatest prayers, right? This is what we talked about today. Because actions speak louder than words. And similarly, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, a mentoring spirit tells us you should pray always. And by that we don't mean that you should confine yourself to a temple or even fall on your knees in a public place. The daily praying that we refer to takes place whenever you attend to your higher duties, whatever they may be. And he says, isn't it an act of devotion to God to help others who are in need? So if we expand on our vision of prayer to incorporate the help that we all extend to one another, then we're obliged to acknowledge, when we're talking about the effects in the material world of the discarnate spirits, we have to acknowledge all the other ways that discarnate spirits reach out to help us. And again, Andre Luis's books are replete with examples of such support. For example, we witness how our spiritual mentors and friends approach us, albeit unseen, to offer us advice, to appeal to our higher senses, and to suggest alternative ways of seeing different situations that we find ourselves in. After which we, of course, have our free will to accept or reject their ideas, but the help is there. We also find examples of spiritual benefactors who apply passes and other magnetic treatments. These affect us. They affect directly our perispiritual body and indirectly our physical body. And this is something that they use to help us in a great number of ways. But in any case, the action of the spiritual realm on our behalf is truly amazing. Andre's instructor, Calderato, who I already mentioned earlier, he made a very nice comment to Andre. And he said, if I can bring it up now, in collaboration with resolute workers, countless legions of co-workers, invisible to the human eye, strive everywhere to aid those who are suffering and to encourage those who are serving the good. Thus our efforts involving the incarnate mind, are extensive and multiple. But we must agree that if this task is a cause of concern, it is also a source of satisfaction. We feel the contentment of older brothers and sisters in being able to help the younger ones. Undoubtedly, in humankind, we are all one family. Something else I want to mention is that it just so happens that the examples from today were of prayers of relatively more advanced spirits. But just as any of us here on earth can and should elevate our thoughts through prayer, so too do those of diverse evolutionary stages living in the spiritual realm. And all have the potential to influence us here in the material world. Likewise, just as we are advised to pray not only for ourselves, but for others, the discarnate spirits do the same. So for anyone who may be wondering if those who've passed on before us still think about us and pray for us, we need not worry, because our love and affection goes on, in spite of the temporary separation that we might be experiencing now. And those loved ones of ours most certainly can pray for us if they're so inclined to do so. And let us not forget that they too can benefit from the prayers that we say for them. In fact, prayer is a great way for us to remain connected in thought. And just to illustrate how important it is that we all pray for one another, I again turn to a comment from that instructor, Calderaro, in an explanation that he was giving to Andre about the assistance of discarnate spirits in the material world, where he clarified that heavenly assistance is not provided indiscriminately. And he told Andre, it is nearly always the power of intercessory prayers that determine which help processes are to be used. So it's so important for us all to pray for one another. Furthermore, he stated to Andre, prayer, represented by an unmanifested desire, inner longings, or spoken petitions, whether originating in the higher regions or emanating from the deep valley of disturbed human passions, is, strictly speaking, the starting point of all our activities. So our understanding of those activities, the activities of our spiritual benefactors, adds a whole new dimension to our understanding of prayer. Through Spiritist literature, then, we begin to see, for example, what happens when we pray. Where do our thoughts go and how? And then when we talk about our prayers being heard and acted upon, in Spiritism, we see how spirits who act as divine emissaries, carrying out God's will to help us, they too employ the resource of prayer in doing so. But we also learn that even though we may think of these spiritual benefactors as angels, they are no different from ourselves in the sense that they too are spirits undergoing a process of evolution. And so they are benefiting from their willingness to help others. Through Spiritism, we are also educated about our own duty to earn the merit for such support. And we are called upon to be instruments in answering one another's prayers. That is something that Spiritism teaches us a lot about, and we have to keep that in mind. And so to close, I would like to leave you with some words from the spirit named Emmanuel, found in his preface to the book, The Messengers. There, Emmanuel proclaims that there is no lack of divine cooperation for the willing worker. But you know what? He says it is not easy to offer assistance to humans. He tells us, bringing the fraternal collaboration of higher planes down to incarnate spirits It's not some mechanical process based on the principles of least effort. So that they may receive such aid, human beings, he says, cannot escape the imperative to wash the vessel of their hearts so as to receive the living water, to take off their worldly rags in order to put on the wedding garments of eternal light. And he later offers a reminder to the reader, stating, only your transformation in the light of higher spirituality will enable you to draw from the spring of divine life. Above all, remember that these uplifting messages from the beyond are not meant to be a mere expression of emotion. They are intended for your understanding as a child of God, so that you will take inventory of your own accomplishments and truly hand yourself over to the responsibility of living in the presence of the Lord. Therefore, my friends, let us remember these words, and in gratitude not only for the opportunity of this incarnation, but also for all of the help that we receive from our spiritual benefactors, let us do our best in this life and work on our inner transformation, so that we may be deserving of the transformative and influential power of their loving prayers. Thank you all, and God bless.